Let's go ahead and get started with our panel discussion. And I wanted to welcome you all. Thank you for joining us. Liam Lee, Martin Hirzel, Erin, LeDell. Thank you. I want to say on a personal note, I really enjoyed all the talks today here, and this kind of forum. Erin, as you were saying, like more of an industry focus for AutoML. I don't think I've ever seen it before. And I wish your talks could have gone on for a couple of hours, because I felt like we were just getting in the groove of it. So I've been looking forward to this discussion amongst us. I know that some people have just been joining us. They may not have been in the earlier sessions. So I'd like to ask if you could go through and just take a couple of minutes to introduce yourself and what projects you're working on, what your main areas of focus are. And we'll start out, Martin, you went first, so can we start out with you?
Sure. Yeah, my name is Martin Hirzel, and I work at IBM Research, where I'm both a researcher and also a manager. And my team is working on the LaLe open source project. LaLe is a library for AutoML that is very much trying to be compatible with scikit-learn. So in order to make it easier to both learn, and then also in order to make it easier to use. So this is the open source software that I talked about in the morning session. And yeah, I'm based in New York, and my background, before I worked on AutoML, I worked on programming language design. So I've been publishing in academic venues for compiler construction and programming languages and things like that, type systems, etc. So sometimes that background comes through when I speak about other topics also.
Very good. Welcome. Thank you. Erin, could you introduce, please?
Sure. I'm Erin Lidell. I work at a company called H2O AI. We basically make machine learning software, and I'm the chief machine learning scientist at H2O AI, and I lead the H2O AutoML project, which is part of the H2O library, which is open source, so you can try it out today if you want. And that's what I gave a talk about earlier today. And yeah, I've been working on AutoML for a number of years. The H2O AutoML algorithm has been out for 3 years now, so we're constantly evolving on it. And yeah, it's nice to be in a group of AutoML folks, my people. So thanks for inviting me.
Thank you kindly. Liam, could you introduce yourself?
Yeah, so I'm Liam. I'm currently a machine learning engineer at Determined, which is an open source platform for deep learning. We basically try to focus on the different aspects of deep learning and automate a lot of that for you, so you can focus on the model development. Prior to Determined, I did a PhD at CMU, where my thesis was on hyperparameter optimization and neural architecture search. And I talked about some of the research that I did in my PhD, and also how you can apply neural architecture search with Determined in practice to your own problems in my talk today. Yeah, so yeah, going forward, I'm excited to sort of implement more state-of-the-art methods in Determined, so that everyone can have access to the algorithms that are kind of used in production by likes of Google and so on to improve the performance of their deep learning models.
Fantastic. Now, for the format for the panel, I have asked for each of our panelists to provide some questions that we can have for discussion topics. But I'd also like to open it up. We wanted to open this up to the audience. If there are additional questions that you'd like to have discussed in more detail, I will moderate those through the chat. So I'll be checking on chat as well as on Slack. And excellent, there are some coming in already. So we'll go through those. I'm going to interleave those with some of the questions from the speakers. And I made a few notes during the talks also. I think there are a couple of points that came up that very much bear some discussion. I'd like to start out with one of those, in fact. I've got to say, Erin, when you were describing some of the importance and use cases of AutoML, there was you'd made a remark about research, which I thought was, for me, one of the most important takeaways that I've heard all day. And there have been a lot of great points across, but I wanted to embellish a bit about how it is that AutoML could be enhancing how we handle publishing papers, how we handle publishing research. Could you embellish a bit about that, and maybe we could discuss it as a group?
Sure. So yeah, I think one of the things that I said on one of the points on my slides was one of the things I think AutoML can be used for is sort of as a baseline or benchmark in any kind of scientific application. So especially new applications where people are not, maybe it's the first time somebody's applied machine learning to some scientific thing in like neuroscience or maybe engineering or something like that. So I do, I've seen a lot of papers where it's like people just use a random forest because they're not necessarily machine learning people. They're just, learning just enough to use a scikit-learn random forest and, report the AUC or something like that. So, but that's the same skill set that you need to just use any AutoML tool for the most part. All the ones that I'm aware of are fairly easy to get going, and a lot of them have a scikit-learn interface, which makes it easier for people if they're coming from that. But what I would like to see is just, when people are doing research, just start with an AutoML tool, doesn't matter which one, and just have that be your baseline. And then you can try to maybe, consult with people or even on your own, try to get a better model. But that should be a good place to start, and then the goal should be getting something better than that.
This seems to fit very well and actually further the cause of the current dialogue about reproducibility in research, and how there's been a big push. I know some of the funding, some of the institutional funding has actually pushed researchers to publish not just the paper, but also the code and the data that went along with it. I think CZI is doing some of that. I may have heard of some of that from Sloan and others. So it seems like this is going even a step further toward that goal of not just reproducibility, but actually furthering the research.
Yeah, and I think it's like a natural progression too, because if you were doing machine learning 10 years ago, scikit-learn was around, some of these things were around, but there was still a lot of like libraries that would have one algorithm in it, and maybe it was hard to install or something like that. So I think having these libraries like scikit-learn or H2O, or on the R side like Caret or Tidy models, things that are sort of an interface to a lot of different algorithms. That was kind of like the first step of like making things more reproducible and easy. And now we're kind of like seeing another step beyond that, which is, maybe we could make the whole process of tuning models somewhat reproducible. And, that if you, I guess the tuning process is sort of like an art form in itself. And
right.
So if we can get people sort of doing some consistent standard things, which are usually embodied by any AutoML tool, then that's kind of just a natural progression of where we've come over the last 10 or 15 years with software.
Right, very good. I mean, as much as I like random forest and have used it in commerce, I don't want it to become the p-values of the 2020s, just sort of the default thing you report. Also, I should add, Martin and Liam, if you want to join in on this. We have some other questions queued up, but if there's anything you want to join in here too, please jump in.
Yeah, I totally agree with the point that AutoML can give you a very good starting baseline. And I want to extend on that point by saying that, well, after you got that starting baseline, it will give you some ideas into intuitions as you explore your model. And then you might want to run it again with a more constrained search space just to find out the sensitivities to some of the hyperparameters, or to maybe you have narrowed it down to a couple of algorithms, but you still want to compare those. And so AutoML also has a place later in the development cycle.
Interesting. That would be interesting to compare essentially degrading resolution, degrading the grid to an extent. Or actually, you stated it in a much better way. I'm not doing it justice.
Yeah. So go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say that, yeah, I agree with what both Erin and Martin said. And I think that hyperparameter tuning has become a pretty important part of model development because it's one way to help people understand how their models behave with respect to generalization and convergence. So I've seen people who use hyperparameter tuning as just a standard part of model development to help them get a better intuitive feel for their models. So, and you know, we all kind of do that already when we manually train models, change the learning rate, see what happens, change the batch size, see what happens. This AutoML and some of the tools that it includes is just a more standardized way for us to do that exploration. And I think some of the research papers that we've seen that compare different methodologies that have been introduced for LSTMs and ConvNets and so on, what they found is once you tune the hyperparameters for many of these models, the performance differences are minuscule. So, so it's really hard to differentiate when you read about a new method, whether that performance gain can be attributed to sort of the novel components that are introduced or whether it's attributed to better tuning. So that is, I think, something we should definitely try to standardize for research so we can actually use the signals from the research papers to form decisions about how we should build our models.
Wonderful, wonderful. And I will add to there was a comment from Ross about how high impact journals are definitely picking up on this. Nature and Science being notable examples, now requiring code snippets for reproducibility and validation. And as I mentioned, I do believe that CZI and some others are also making requirements to include access to data where that makes sense. So some other questions coming in. One I think is very poignant from Brad Smith. Are there any published guidelines or best practices that are documented for AutoML which pertain to academic research outside of computer science? Because I think so far this has been a lot of what we've covered today has been very much heavily oriented toward what we do in computer science.
That's a good question. I mean, I can point, I don't know if I would consider this outside of computer science, but maybe it's sort of worth mentioning, which is that, there is this benchmark called the AutoML benchmark, which is something that I was involved with, along with a number of other AutoML researchers, where we attempted to establish what at least best practices around benchmarking systems, because that's, one of the things that people like to do when they have a new system is generate some benchmarks. And after many years of doing this myself and others, it's almost impossible to not be biased when you're benchmarking your own system against others. So, we put up some guidelines and best practices and then implemented that within a system that is open source that people can use to benchmark AutoML systems. But within that is kind of all the best practices that we thought were useful for using AutoML tools in general, and especially how to compare them to each other, which is something that people do. But I don't know, outside of computer science, if there's anything specific that I could say on that.
I think there are some best practices and guidelines that just apply to machine learning in general, whatever domain you are working in. So, I mean, just off the top of my head, very simple things like before you start learning, just take a look at your data to see what it even is and try to get a feeling for it. Or try not to overfit, so hold out some data so that you can get some feeling for how much you are overfitting. Or a large amount of data beats a complicated model. Or I guess another one would be try to find the simplest model that that has an acceptable accuracy. So because otherwise you might be, even if on the test set you're not obviously overfitting, you might be using a model that's too big a hammer for your particular problem. So all of these apply in machine learning in general, in whatever domain it is being applied. And some of them are, I guess, exacerbated in AutoML, in particular the overfitting related issues.
Yeah,
Oh.
I just have a quick thing to add. I'm not aware of anything outside of computer science, but in computer science for the academic research community and for the field of neuroarchitecture search in particular, there's been a checklist that's been developed for reproducibility best practices. So the checklist includes things like first, making sure you provide the code that you're using and document all the details of the compute environment you're using, provide information on the data, run your experiment multiple times to capture the variance of the model that you're training, and so on. So I think these best practices also just apply in general if you're doing any sort of research with machine learning and relying on the statistics or results of a model.
That does bring to mind. There was somebody out of biology in UCSD, and I recall that. I know that this is going around the Jupyter community, but there were like 10 steps to reproducibility, a paper that came out. Trying to look that up. Also, Erin, if you have a link, I'd love to see the link about guidelines for benchmarking.
Sure,
and
I can probably pull it up pretty quickly. Yeah.
And you know, really, and Martin, also what you were saying, you know, what this brings to mind also is that as AutoML is moving from, or has moved from research, or rather I should say elements of AutoML have moved from research into industry, this also really begs an important question in industry of how do organizations vet the claims for particular approaches? What kind of benchmarking techniques can a given organization use to try to understand a product? And so, you know, the point I'm trying to make there is that benchmarking is not just for the sake of academic publishing, but I think it'll become even more poignant as we see a lot more use cases that have critical needs, and AutoML is fitting into those pipelines.
Yeah, one lesson there is don't rest on your laurels. So just because you build a good model that somebody deploys doesn't mean you're done, because after they deploy it, that's when they get the production traffic, and that's when you find out how it actually did.
Right.
And it might have done well on your metrics, but the metrics that actually matter for the application might be more indirect, and therefore only emerge really when in production.
Awesome. OpenML benchmarking framework. Thank you, Erin. That's great.
Kind of related to follow up to what Martin just said is, I think also this is pretty common in the AutoML community, which is kind of a focus on, you know, who's got the best model, and there's a lot of ways to measure that. And so even our benchmark that we produced, you know, there is a focus on accuracy as being kind of the main thing that we're benchmarking, but then what we've seen is, you know, people starting to produce more complex AutoML systems that are maybe a bit impractical, like in real life. So like, let's say, you know, a 20-layer stacked ensemble or something like that. So stuff that's more like for winning Kaggle competitions, but not so practical in real life. And so one of the things that we're adding to this framework as we move forward, because it's kind of an ongoing effort to evolve over time, is, you know, when we're measuring things like accuracy and making choices based on that, we should also be thinking about, like, what is this going to be like in production? What is the prediction speed of this model compared to the accuracy, and do kind of a more holistic analysis when we choose either an AutoML tool or even just a single model or something like that outside of the AutoML framework. Is yeah, I mean, if your goal is to design something for a production use case, you have to think about like the stuff that Martin said, but also just, you know, basic stuff like, is this model too complex to perform in production, or should we choose something simpler? And it's better to think about that at the beginning before you spend a lot of time, you know, over optimizing for accuracy.
Definitely, the cost, the loaded cost for that, and the risks especially are, it's so much more important to catch that early in the development phase. And that's a really good segue also to Erin, to one of the questions that you'd proposed. Also, someone from the audience, Bill, had asked a very much related question. So I'll paraphrase this. I don't think I heard anything about tools to highlight AI ethics hotspots in a model. And beyond that, is feedback mechanism for the non-computer scientist assumptions. Okay, so we're using a model that may have been trained in a certain way to verify that if that is the case, and to alert the rest of the community that incorporating these models ethics possibilities back in their tool ecosystem. So yeah, you know, this is something I was really hoping we get to discuss in the panel, because I think that we're all seeing parts of this, definitely. There are a range of different issues of where this has social impact. Ethics, there's a whole continuum there. We can talk about AI trust, or I'd like to dig into that. And also other social issues as well. Certainly energy and policy considerations. There was a great paper about that recently. Erin, you're on screen right now. I'll let you pick up on that, and I'd like to go also through everyone to talk about what are the issues beyond machine learning accuracy that really strike more about people issues.
Well, I think like the general umbrella term for what we're talking about would be like algorithmic fairness. And that is really like a not well-defined term, and it's more of an umbrella rather than a thing that you can measure precisely, I think, because the term, I mean, the term fairness can consider all sorts of things, including whether or not applying machine learning to a particular use case is ethical to begin with. I think people sometimes, even though there has been a lot of work in the algorithmic fairness space in the last couple of years, and it's actually becoming a little bit more mainstream now, there's always this tendency for, you know, engineering type people to be focused on metrics and tech and stuff like that. So it's we don't want to find ourselves in another case of like, well, why don't we just build the tech to solve this fairness thing, and, you know, sort of outsource our ethical or social responsibility to some, you know, metric in the machine learning model.
Right.
I think that evaluating models based on algorithmic fairness is important, but also we need to think about like what happens if that model is deployed into production? Who is it affecting? How, you know, is that even an ethical thing? I mean, there's just been so many just catastrophes with this stuff. A colleague of mine at H2O even has like what he calls like I forget what the exact name that he has for it, but it's essentially an incident tracker of things where AI was really misused and kind of blew up in a horrific way. So one of the recent things that people are talking about in the last, let's say, month or two was because of the pandemic, there was no way to kind of finish off the school year, you know, last year. So then there were, you know, schools and even countries experimenting with assigning grades algorithmically, and that was just ended up to be like a huge, colossal failure, and everybody in the UK was all upset about this. And it sounds like the model was, you know, not very good to begin with, but also, you know, maybe that didn't need to be solved with AI. Maybe it could have just been solved by like, let's sit down, consult the teacher knows the students, kind of the teacher comes up with the grade or something like that. So they, you know, there's some cases where maybe that's just not a really good solution, just because when you're talking about people's lives and people thinking they're going to get to go to college and then they can't, or you know, that's sort of a big one. But then there's all sorts of things with policing and assigning sentencing, guidelines based on AI, and all of that stuff is just like a really bad feedback loop for lots of pre-existing biases. And so I think when we talk about fairness, it's always important to just first consider, is this something really that should be handled by machine learning at all? And if so, then we need to be very strict about how we measure the impact on different subgroups of the, like, let's say, comparing different just demographics and how the model is performing on them. And if it's not equally performant, then think about what that means and what the impacts are. So there's just like a lot of focus on developing tools, but there also needs to be more larger conversations, I think, about this stuff, especially as we're making it so easy for everybody to use. I mean, some of these things are even just accidents. You have somebody who's sort of maybe new to data science, and maybe they didn't have Martin's advice of monitoring your models in production. Like, maybe that's not something the person knows about yet. But there's by having tools that are making it quite easy for anyone to use, we have people that are not seasoned data scientists who know how to look for these things in advance, and so we're possibly sort of encouraging deployment of models that have not been properly checked. So I think sometimes it can just be an accident. Sometimes it's people not thinking about the ethical consequences, etc. There's a lot of things that fall under this.
Yeah, I think it's the good news, bad news kind of situation. The good news is that there are now both metrics and mitigation algorithms that you can use in an AutoML context. So you can measure your fairness, and you can also mitigate the fairness of your model. Now that sounds almost too good, because it would then absolve us of the responsibility. Unfortunately, both these metrics and the mitigation have to be configured. And when you configure them, you have to answer difficult questions, such as which attribute of your data could you be unfair about? Is it religion or gender or age or etc.? Or what level of disparate impact are you willing to accept, or what level of disparate impact goes beyond what is acceptable for your organization? Or even which of the metrics is acceptable to use. And then, of course, there's a bigger societal discussion about affirmative action and in which circumstances it is appropriate, and so on and so on. So I think, as technologists, we can say, well, here are the tools, and we can make sure that they are available to people building models, including building models in an AutoML context. But you have to remind the users, in other words, the model builders, to then consult with their organization, and ideally even with broader applicable regulations and laws to make a best effort at doing the right thing, right? So I guess I should mention, so there's an open source toolkit called the AIF360 toolkit, which has a whole bunch of metrics and algorithms for that. Yeah, but that said, it doesn't mean you can turn your brain off. It is an assistance, not a replacement for acting ethically.
I should mention, I was very interested. I've actually done some demos in meetups of using AIF360, the integration with Lale. There's a very nice set of notebooks for that.
Yeah, thanks a lot for mentioning that. Yeah, so we have been playing with that in Lale. And of course, if you have a metric, you can do a bunch of things with that. One is you can build your model and then measure afterwards. But the other is you can jointly optimize for multiple objectives, such as, say, accuracy as well as fairness, as defined by whichever metric you have chosen for it. Maybe one more thing to mention is, so we've been focusing on fairness. There are a couple of other dangers, I guess. One is robustness. So I think everybody has heard of these ways to trick vision models, for instance, by putting a sticker on a traffic sign, and now suddenly it gets misclassified. And then another one is privacy, where if your model is trained from personal identifying information, then an adversary might be able to extract some of that information just by asking the right questions out of that model. So these are other things to consider.
Yeah, I think also from the data perspective, like we've talked a lot about model diagnostics and model verification, but really I think there's another side to this, which is making sure that you are happy with the distribution of your data. Like, do you feel that your data is a good representation of the population that you're building a model for? Are you treating certain subgroups within the data in the right way, and so on? So I think also diagnosing data blind spots or existing data biases is something that there's been less attention on in some of the research work, just because it's much easier to characterize like algorithmic fairness than it is to detect existing biases in your data. But yeah, I think AutoML can really help with like creating this Pareto trade-off curve of sort of how much fairness you can guarantee while still trying to get the highest accuracy that you can, because that frontier, you don't know that beforehand, and certain AutoML tools will help you discover that frontier faster so that you can make the right trade-off decisions for your problem.
To help go along with that, I pasted in, there's let me dig this up here. Sam Corbett-Davies and Sherrod Gwell from Stanford Human-Centered AI Institute. But they had the paper measuring mismeasures of fairness, which really have some great illustrations about how trying to make fairness a metric is provably hard, if not impossible. But you have to own it. And the more you can quantify it and understand that kind of front of where you make those responsible decisions, this is what AutoML can really highlight. There's a lot of questions coming in. I'm going to try to sequence, some of these are overlapping, so I'll try to sequence them in. Liam, there was something you were showing that I think is also a really important point to bring away. In terms of recent state-of-the-art, using Gaia, the delta between darts and Gaia, we could see dramatic performance increase. And what struck me is that if people right now, say on the industry side especially, if they're looking at what's happening in research and they're looking at some of these rates that are being quoted about how many thousands of days it takes to train a model, and then they're making linear projections out of saying, well, if this gets adopted in industry where there's 100,000 use cases, this will be the cost. It strikes me that we're at a point in time where making those kind of linear projections is, number one, they're not any good. Number two, they could be they could be working against us. Yeah, I would say that I think there's reason to be optimistic about AutoML and given kind of what we discussed in my talk, the neural architecture subcomponent. And I did present in the talk, I did mention that there are certain drawbacks with existing neural architecture search methods, but I do think the trend is towards more efficient, more robust, and more performant. So, like we've seen in the past 2 years, the computational costs associated with NOS go from thousands of GPU days to now just 4 GPU days. And I actually expect the cost to get even lower, because I think we'll develop better methods in order to share knowledge between NOS problems and NOS tasks, right? So if we have some prior knowledge already about which architectures work well for ImageNet, presumably those architectures will also work pretty well for a different image classification data set, or like a related computer vision task. So like developing ways to more efficiently transfer this information to new data sets, to new problem spaces, I think will also dramatically reduce the cost. And we see some of that already, just based on kind of the progress in the research world, where Google will go and spend 3,000 GPU days to do architecture search and find something like MobileNet v3. And then they'll release that
to the public, and you can then use that NOS found architecture for your data sets. And then we have methods that are building on top of that architecture as a backbone and fine-tuning it for specific applications in kind of a narrower NOS search space that have been able to improve the performance even more. So, I'm actually very optimistic. I think the trend is faster and more accurate, especially as we start to look into transfer learning to do some of these things.
I should ask a question. I'll put on, or I'll put myself in the position of, say, an engineering manager who's not really familiar with machine learning. It seems like deep learning in general, we're still in relatively early days. It's only been a few years. It stands to reason that there's a lot of room ahead for dramatic increase in performance, as you're saying. And then I'll take that hat off and I'll quote Michael Mahoney out of Berkeley, that there are some parts of deep learning that really the mathematicians who study algorithms don't really understand what's going on, or there's not a clear quantification of what's going on yet. There's problems of, or at least, I'm paraphrasing Mahoney there, but would part of that fit in with what you're saying, that there's a lot of room ahead for optimization?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of things that are mystified, like that are pretty crazy about deep learning. Like there are just a lot of things we don't understand about neural networks in terms of why they're able to generalize despite being so large and heavily over parameterized.
Yeah.
And I think answering these questions will help us go a long way towards understanding what's happening from a theoretical perspective behind like this deep learning revolution. But that doesn't mean that the existing models that are out there right now aren't useful. Like we've seen that they can be useful even without us having a good understanding, but there are definitely certain pitfalls that come up around adversarial robustness and so on that we can hopefully get a better grasp on by developing a deeper theoretical understanding of these algorithms. But who knows, maybe it could be the case that there's a trade-off between robustness and performance and ease of training. So you want models to be large, and if they're large, they're easier to train, but then you're like stuck with like edge cases and adversarial examples just because they're so large. So I think there's just trade-offs that we don't understand well yet, and we really need to in order to kind of have more robust solutions going forward for both fairness and security.
Wonderful.
I think there's a similar trend probably happening outside of the NAS space as well. So in the more, traditional machine learning, or whatever we're calling it these days, to go beyond just throwing computation power at these tasks. I think there's people working on, the term meta learning is a bit overused, like in machine learning, to mean a couple different things, but there's this idea of meta learning where we train machine learning algorithms on a whole bunch of data sets, and then we kind of can predict from that data like what the good values of hyperparameters are in advance. So I guess it's a sort of cousin to transfer learning in a way, but yeah, I think that's also going to be the trend in structured tabular data systems as well. That use more traditional methods like GBMs and random forests and things like that. Yeah, because that's basically what we're doing, is we're just trying to find like hacks to not spend so much time computing all this stuff so that we can find the best model. And I think using techniques like transfer learning or just meta learning in general will change a lot over the next years. And then I just shared a link in the chat as well by Rachel Thomas, who's of Fast AI, and she's written a whole lot about sort of the evolution of the different AutoML strategies related to neural architecture search and how they relate to transfer learning and some of the trade-offs and some of the developments of some of the stuff that Liam was just talking about.
Well, I'd like to ask a little bit more about some of the overloading of the term meta learning. I agree. I've seen it be used for various different things. It strikes me that there's a lot of opportunity to apply at least some sense of meta learning in a team context, organizational context, of trying to understand from the history of what a data science team has been doing, at least where some of the better starting points for hyperparameters for particular data sets that they have to revisit over and over. It strikes me that there's a lot of work that we do essentially from scratch and a lot of wasted effort that could be taken off the table by having more effective means of at least that kind of workflow perspective of meta learning. And I'll admit that's an intuition at this point that I have. I haven't really seen the proof of that yet, but I was going to pose that to the panel as well.
There is a Metalearning Workshop at NeurIPS that, that would be the place that I would recommend people looking into these new techniques. Just wanted to throw that out there. I don't have a link handy, but I'm sure if you Google it, you can find it. But yeah, I mean, that's all I have to say, I guess.
Yeah, I think that is a really interesting direction for research, and I've given it some thought previously. And there's been some existing work on it. So if you go and look at AutoSKlearn, they basically use a meta learning method where they've run a bunch of hyperparameter tuning experiments on OpenML datasets, and they trained basically random forests models on them, and also run things like nearest neighbors, so that you can compare your new data set and your new problem to sort of hyperparameter tuning experiments that have been run previously on data sets, and using a nearest neighbor type approach, they're able to recommend new hyperparameters or starting hyperparameters that you should try based on similarities to previous experiments. So something like that is available open source. I mean, there are also approaches based on kind of Bayesian optimization that have been sort of introduced in research, where you kind of model the relationship between your different hyperparameters and your different tasks. But underlying that is the assumption that you're using the same search space for all of your data, which can be restrictive unless your search space is gigantic and includes everything that you could possibly try. So, but regardless, I think it's definitely a really interesting direction for research. I'm pretty sure that is something that might happen already in some of the existing AutoML systems, where they use like collaborative filtering type methods as well to do matching. So if you look at the outputs of your experiments, you compare them. If they're similar, then you try to borrow results or hyperparameters from related experiments and so on. So it's a great idea. I think some of it is already available now for people to try. But another like meta learning, another sort of field that is also called meta learning, but is kind of unrelated, is this idea of learning across related tasks. And I think meta learning can extend beyond sort of this model space that we've been talking about to the data space, where you have sharing of data in a private sense across participants that are, say, trying to solve a related problem, right? So if you have a network of hospitals, you can use meta learning to let them share hospital data so they can all perform better on their task of interest. And that's a really interesting use case, I think, to explore, in the sense that it'll be important to both try to preserve privacy while you're doing the sharing, but also make the sharing as useful as possible for all the participants. So that is kind of, I think, the other usual field that is called meta learning, is kind of this learning across related tasks.
Interesting, very interesting. And there have been use cases coming up of where even fierce competitors are now recognizing opportunities to share data, to learn enough from each other to be able to move ahead of maybe a bar their regulator has placed on them. So I'm thinking of Michelin and Pirelli combining data sets to be able to learn off of them in tandem. Martin, I wanted to give you an opportunity to jump in on this one too. I didn't know.
I don't have too much to add. I wasn't aware that that sometimes there's a blurred line between meta learning and federated learning. I think there's also sometimes a blurred line between meta learning and transfer learning. I guess what they all have in common is to reuse what you have learned elsewhere, and of course that can help in saving time. Maybe the most practical and widely accepted form of transfer learning is text embeddings. So, I mean, if you build models that involve any kind of natural language text, you'll probably not start from scratch, but you'll start from some kind of pre-trained embedding on a big corpus and then adapt that to your data set.
That's a good point. I wanted to follow up also, Martin, you had a great question here about a discussion about AutoML in the context of the kind of tools that are being put forth in front of practitioners, in front of data science teams. How easy is it to understand the resulting pipelines, the outputs of AutoML, and also what kind of features can we use to help support that? I mean, that seems that's probably an even more tangible and more immediate problem to some of the questions about ethics. In that, if the practitioners can really understand what's being produced and what they're working with, because I've got to admit, at times it's quite opaque.
Yeah, I guess the use case of somebody who knows fairly little about machine learning and can use an AutoML tool to get an initial pipeline as a baseline, or maybe that's already good enough for their purpose, is a really good one. And so if we are assuming that that the data scientist is not extremely experienced and high skilled, then as builders of AutoML tools, we have to make an extra effort to make sure that these pipelines that they get are actually understandable. And of course, simplicity helps with understanding, but also expressing the pipeline that you get back in the same terms as what you might have written by hand manually from first principles, say in scikit-learn. I guess we are strong believers in that, and so far our users have been kind of confirming that hypothesis.
I'm curious. Oh, sorry, I'm getting an echo. So I'm curious, has there been use cases in terms of regulatory compliance or auditors wanting to look at pipelines and using that kind of serialization, reflection, if you will, based off of AutoML?
So actually, even before you get there, there's a data scientist who is working in a bigger organization may need to explain their model to their boss or to the people who then deploy that model in their own application. And in order to explain that, of course, you need some kind of, at least, even for communication among techies, I guess, is what I'm saying. Having some representation of a pipeline that everybody can understand is extremely useful. Then I guess when you go further towards, say, regulatory compliance, there I think you then also need to look at things like feature importance. So not just here's how my model looks in terms of the algorithms that I put in there, but also here's what my model looks like in terms of which features it considered to what extent and how much did they influence the final decisions. That can be equally valuable there. And of course, inspecting the results of the model in a more fine-grained way, say with a confusion matrix or broken down by segments of your data set is extremely useful as well.
Thank you. I wanted to, one of the questions that was asked early ties into a few other questions that have come along. So I did want to toss this one into the ring for general discussion. Farhad had a great question. What's the dirty secret of AutoML for practitioners? I think we've been talking a lot about the benefits, but I mean, I know exactly how I'd answer it, and I'm going to zip my mouth. I'd love to hear from each of you what you think are some of the downsides of the dirty secrets. What's being swept under the rug?
I think that most AutoML tools don't address the pipeline issue enough, like the data augmentation, or there's a lot of AutoML tools that are essentially, they are model tuning tools. There's some that include the pipeline in that process. For example, Teapot. There's probably others, but I think the dirty secret is like there's still a whole lot of manual work that goes into the pre-modeling phase, the data preparation, even things like encoding, categoricals in different ways, or generating interactions, all of this stuff. Like there's a whole lot of software that's doing, really like the easy part, which is the modeling. And the automated feature engineering tool space is very nascent, I guess, and underdeveloped. And I think that's what I would say as an answer to that question. And hopefully we'll get some more open source tools out there that can do this stuff, because the only ones that I know about are closed source. So I'll stop.
Thank you. The great answer, and I'm glad to hear the dogs too. That's comforting. Yeah. I'll open that up. Liam or Martin? Yes.
Yeah, I can go. Yeah, I think Erin really hit the nail on the head there. Like, I think the dirty secret, to me at least, maybe I'm missing some information about how like Google and Amazon do their AutoML. But to me, AutoML right now is still a good amount of hyperparameter optimization. And hyperparameter optimization is really good for the model development phase, but I'm not convinced that it's the right solution for all the stages of the machine learning pipeline. There's been some work on automating data preprocessing and feature generation, but I haven't really seen any really compelling work there. And I think this is like, and it's kind of not surprising that this is the kind of the state of the world right now, because if you want to expand AutoML to include all the parts of the pipeline, that search space just gets intractable very quickly. So you're going to need kind of very, like much more domain specific solutions for each part of the pipeline. And I think it's exciting to see, research in other parts of the workflow where you have people looking at active learning methods to help you collect data more efficiently, and then also downstream where you have people building model diagnostic tools to help you improve robustness and fairness and so on. But I think it's going to be hard to bring all of that into an automated solution unless we kind of develop strong priors for each of those workflows, and then glue them together via transfer learning somehow way in the future. I don't think we're quite there yet, but I do think that means there's exciting work to be done in this field still.
Very good.
Maybe one more thing to add is AutoML sounds very automated. So you click a button, you get a model, you're done. But really, you get a model, and then you continue experimenting. And before you click that button again, you configure your AutoML system, or you constrain the search space, or you modify something else, and then you try again. So it can give you a good baseline, but in the end, it's going to only augment, but not replace manual experimentation.
I mean, that's also been one of the questions that's been coming up a few times, is to what extent are we just getting rid of this need for machine learning expertise? To what extent, actually, let me quote directly, but are these platforms mature enough to be used by subject matter experts without having the expertise of a senior data scientist, machine learning engineer in the pipeline?
I mean, I think it's probably, I think the place where that could be useful is if you have a small startup and you don't want to pay a data scientist and you have to make choices. But I think if you're doing data science or machine learning, you're going to have to pay somebody who knows what they're doing. Even if you use automated tools to produce everything, I think it's important to sort of have that extra manual check on things. And so perhaps like the data scientist job evolves a bit more into more of a, like, let me check what the, automated system has. It's kind of the same question that we hear about, doctors being like, are we going to be replaced by these, computer vision algorithms and all this stuff? And I think it's not, I don't think you can really, maybe in the very far future, you could kind of do a whole hands-off thing. But I think because the thing that we were talking about, which is that most AutoML tools concentrate on this narrow space of model of hyperparameter optimization, we're always going to be needing people to understand, like, where is the data coming from, what's going into the model, is the result that you're trying to predict somehow embedded within all the other features, or once you productionize the model, is it losing its relevancy as the data shifts over time? Like, if we can start to automate some of these other parts of the pipeline, I think we could get closer. But right now, I would say, unless it's a very straightforward thing and you have some basic understanding about data science, I would say you probably want a data scientist to still be in the loop for now.
Definitely. We only have a few minutes left. I definitely wanted to bring up, I'll just throw in as a footnote, I'd included the question that I circulated earlier amongst us. Jeff Dean very famously had this talk at TensorFlow Dev World where they were talking about how, of course, there's a talent crunch. It's very hard to hire people into roles where they have a deep bench of experience working in machine learning. And this is a kind of role that's very much in demand. And so, what was offered is that, or a solution that was offered is that if you just increase the cloud budget by 100x, we can wipe a lot of people out of the equation and substitute in AutoML instead. And I don't believe I'm taking that out of context. I don't want to pick on Jeff at all. But I have heard others saying this as well. So I kind of wanted to ask about that statement. Is that science fiction? Is there a trade-off between hiring a large staff and paying 100x on your cloud bill, or are we still looking ahead?
Well, in that case, you also have to push out your deadlines. So if you're willing to not just increase your cloud budget, but also wait until all those runs complete, then maybe you can make some headway. But yeah, no, I don't think it's really the solution. I think almost on a psychological side, it can help people get started who would otherwise feel daunted. And then once they have that first model in hand, they might feel more comfortable continuing on their journey. And so, yes, you can start at a slightly lower skill level than you might otherwise, or slightly lower confidence level than you might otherwise.
Yeah.
I think there's probably some truth to what he's saying, that there clearly is a benefit to using AutoML tools, and it does make data scientists more efficient, even if they are sophisticated data scientists. But I think that's also maybe, if you work at a company where, the product is like cloud computing, like you see solutions in a certain way. So, that is maybe one approach, but I don't know that it's maybe the best approach, but it's certainly like, if I had a giant compute cloud and I was Google, then that's the solution that I would say. And Jeff Dean is a great guy, and I follow him on Twitter. he's great. But I'm just thinking like that's kind of maybe a little bit narrow way to approach it. But it is an approach. So it's an expensive one, but it's, yeah.
Well said. Alrighty, we're up on time. I want to thank the three of you, Liam, Erin, Martin. Thank you very much for your discussion today. There have been a lot of great links that have come in here. We tried to get through a lot of the questions that came in. I really appreciate everyone who's been posting questions in the audience. You know, and I think that there's a lot of sidebar conversation going on as well. So I hope to be able to follow this up, but I wanted to thank you very much for your insights today.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for hosting.